So when we introduced loops, we introduced this while keyword. And with that, we got a piece of code, or something that allows us to repeat a step of a set of instructions until some condition is falsified. And that's great and all, but there's some nuances with this code that make it a little less idiomatic than we would like. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, first of all, this condition can be simplified to index is less than s.length. And why can we do that? Because we push the negation inward to flip the operator. Because remember that greater than or equal to, or rather the negation of greater than or equal to, is just less than. Okay? Another thing is that we have duplicate code in both of these branches. So, because ACC does not depend on index, what we could do is move this out of this else block, get rid of the else block, and then just remove the statement from the if block. Okay? So now our code is considerably shorter, which is nice, but another issue that may not seem as important right now is the fact that this index variable lives outside of the scope or the visibility of the while loop. But do we really need that to be true? Because notice that the only reason index exists is because we need it inside of this loop. And the only thing that index does is, well, index into the string. Rather, it gets the character at a specific index. Okay? So, what we would like is a construct that removes the fact that we have this index here and only puts it inside of the scope of this loop. Okay? So, fortunately in Java, there is something called the for loop. A for loop has three components. It has something called an initializer, it has something called a condition, and it has something called a step expression. So let's talk about what each one of these mean. So, the init thing is where we can declare variables that should be visible only to the scope of this for loop. So for example, let's say we wanted a for loop that declares a variable I, sets it equal to 0. Okay? Now we'll come back to the rest of the things here, but when we've done this, this means that the variable I is live, or is visible, only to the contents. Sorry, my cat is trying to claw my door down. This I is live or visible only inside of this for loop. Okay? It doesn't exist outside of the for loop, and that's what's nice about it. Okay? Now, the conditional is just like a while loop. It means we want some condition to be checked every time we go through an iteration of the loop, which governs whether the loop will continue. Okay? And again, we'll come back to that in the context of count chars. The step expression is what we can do to change variables. So, for example, we could have something like I is equal to I plus 1, and the different font, or the different, not font, the different color is just because I forgot to swap here, but notice what exactly does this mean here. So, whenever let's suppose that there's some code inside of this for loop that runs, and when we get to the bottom here, before we jump back up to the top, we're going to run this statement here, or Java will run whatever statements are in these part of this stepper thing here. Okay? So when we get to the bottom of a for loop, it will implicitly increment I by 1. Or we could have anything here. We could say I is incremented by 2. We could have it say I is multiplied by 200. It doesn't matter. Okay? So let's see what this looks like in our example here. So we want to abstract this index variable away into a for loop. So how do we do that? Well, first let's just comment it out. And let's also comment this stuff out. So let's just begin typing. So a for loop has the for keyword. And again, it has three components. We have the initializer, we have the condition, and we have the stepper. So we want to declare a variable I, which we'll just say takes place of index, and we're going to set that equal to 0. Okay? Now, if we want to replicate the behavior of index equals index plus 1, we can write I equals I plus 1. Okay? So after every iteration of the loop, we're going to increment I by 1. Now, notice that the loop condition depends on what the value of I is. So, let's write this out. So, I is less than s.length. Okay? So, what does this all mean? So, we declare a variable called I is equal to, set it equal to 0. We're going to continue this loop as long as I is less than s.length, and then we're going to, every time we go through the loop, we're going to increment I by 1. Okay? But all of that is still a little bit of a mystery until we introduce the code inside of the loop. So, what does that look like? Well, we just want to do the same thing that we did before. If the ith character is equal to C, we're going to increment a counter, the counter being ACC. So, if s.charat of I is equal to C, we're going to set ACC equal to ACC plus 1. Okay? Now notice that we do not put I is equal to I plus 1 here, because if we did, then that would mean that I gets incremented twice, because we would increment I right here, and then before we jump back up to the top of the loop, I would be incremented again, which is not good. Okay? So, let's get rid of that, and let's get rid of all of this code, get rid of this, and we'll rerun our tests, and everything passes. Okay? In the next video, we'll trace out the for loop, and we'll show what happens with each iteration.